I hope you enjoy this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. I also want to thank the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being for sponsoring this course, and you can check that school out at divineinfinitebeing.com. After Death, an historical motion picture. On October 27, 2023, Angel Studios released a documentary about near-death experiences in theaters in the US and Canada called After Death. So Angel Studios is the same filmmaking studio that made The Sound of Freedom, which was a hit movie in 2023, and the television series The Chosen about Jesus of Nazareth. It's a multi-series television program. They're both very popular, so they put out this documentary After Death, which we'll be going over. And it will start by talking about the history of near-death experience studies in the U.S. So continuing the slide, history of NDE research in America. Dr. George Ritchie Jr., MD, a psychiatrist. He was the first to lecture on his NDE, which occurred on December 1st, 1943. He had pneumonia. He wrote a book about this called Return from Tomorrow, which was published in 1978. So let me just talk about Dr. Ritchie's experience. So he's 20 years old, and he was a private in the United States Army at Camp Barkley in Texas, and he was going the next day to catch a train to Richmond to get a degree at the Medical College of Virginia in psychiatry. But he came down with pneumonia, and he passed out, and he died. They said he died for 9 minutes, and during that process he experienced himself looking down at his body from where he had been. Actually, in the beginning of the story that I went and watched elsewhere from various interviews with him from YouTube, he said he walked out of the room where his body had been placed, and he was going to ask somebody he met in the hall how to get to the train to Richmond. He was intent on getting to Richmond to further his medical career, and he walked right through the person. And he said he was in denial. He didn't question how miraculous that was. So then he got out of the building, and he just started flying. He started flying towards Virginia. So he's hovering over the earth, flying over the forests. He said he saw at some point a store beneath him, and someone was walking in, so he landed to ask the person, how do you get to Richmond? And the person just ignored him as if he wasn't there. And then he said he was walking around the town, and he put his hand through a cable holding up, I think, a telephone pole, and his hand went right through it. And then he realized, oh, something's not right. And he recalled that he left something back at the Army base in Texas, so he just immediately found himself there again, and he was looking for his body. And he realized he'd left his body behind, and then he said it was hard for me to recognize myself looking at all the different soldiers lying in I guess it was the hospital ward of the Army base, because we never see ourselves except for in a mirror. So he finally found this body, that head was covered with a sheet. He looked at the finger, and he saw his class ring with a stone missing in just the place where the ring on that he had a stone missing. And then he realized, oh, I'm dead. And then he had a series of experiences, beginning with a light filling the room and saying, stand up, you're in the presence of the Son of God. So he said he met Jesus Christ, and Jesus then walked him through 4 stages of the afterlife. Everything is made of empathy and love. In the documentary After Death, they don't get too deeply into the details. They show an interview with him and Joan Rivers, and in that same series, Joan Rivers then interviewed Dr. Raymond Moody. So returning to the slide, Dr. Raymond Moody, MD, PhD, heard Ritchie lecture at the University of Virginia in 1965. He then published the international bestseller Life After Life in 1975, in which he coined the phrase near-death experience. So we've been talking about Raymond Moody throughout this class and this series on near-death experiences. So he was the one who coined the phrase near-death experience. So let me read a little bit. I took some notes about Raymond Moody. So he's a philosopher, a psychiatrist, and a physician. So he got his bachelor's, his master's, and his PhD in philosophy from the University of Virginia in 1969. He got a PhD in psychology from the University of West Georgia. Then he got his medical degree in psychiatry from the Medical College of Georgia, and he was a forensic psychiatrist at the Maximum Security Georgia State Hospital, which reminded me of Carl Jung. He spent time working at the insane asylum in Switzerland, and he's got a lot of his ideas about the archetypes of the collective unconscious from analyzing those patients in that severe situation. So Raymond Moody first heard about near-death experiences, or at least he did hear from Dr. George Ritchie, who became a psychiatrist. And this is the history of near-death experience studies. So here's a quote from Raymond Moody in the documentary After Death. In 1969, I became a professor of philosophy at East Carolina University, and in teaching courses on Plato, I began to hear these experiences from my students and also from other faculty members. So in 1965, he heard about George Ritchie's near-death experience, and he kept hearing them. It's notable that he said while teaching courses on Plato, students and other faculty members talked to him about near-death experiences. Because, as we know, Plato's famous myth of talks about the soldier who woke up on his own funeral pyre and then was allowed to witness what happens in between incarnations on the earth. The most important part for this class is that he experienced the threads of destiny out at the outermost horizon of the cosmos, where the three singing sister goddesses of the fates, who represent past, present, and future, were weaving the reincarnating souls the threads of their destiny. So that's a clear parallel with holographic string theory. And I'm saying that these near-death experiences, especially Carl Jung's, where he experienced each cubic volume of space tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread, that the parallels between near-death experiences and holographic string theory provide evidence for both. Near-death experiences gain scientific authenticity or support from holographic string theory, and holographic string theory, which is notoriously unempirically observable because the strings are too small to see down at the Planck scale, it nevertheless gains this border realm of empirical validation from these near-death experience accounts. The question is, do you consider these near-death experiences as empirical evidence? The people experience them, but they don't experience them through their bodily sense organs, but they do experience them through sensory perception. They see and they smell, they taste and they hear. So Carl Jung would say a dream is empirical evidence. Are near-death experiences empirical evidence? If so, do they provide empirical evidence for holographic string theory? Those are some of the questions to consider. But continuing with this series of slides. International Association for Near-Death Studies, IANDS. So in the documentary After Death, Raymond Moody talks about how he and some other colleagues formed this group. So I'm going to just read from the slide. Moody met with other academic NDE researchers, Bruce Grayson, Kenneth Ring, and Michael Sabom. They formed a group to compare notes in 1978, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. This was the beginning of NDE research, and they launched the Journal of Near-Death Studies in 1982. So academia began with Plato, and the original curriculum for the original academy is found in the Republic, which ends with the near-death experience of the myth of So it's fitting that the academic journal of near-death studies in the history of academia, it's bringing us full circle back to Plato. So here's a quote from Dr. Michael Sabom. He's a cardiologist. He's the author of Recollections of Death. He says, I was brought into this field kicking and screaming. So he describes how he read Moody's book and thought it was hogwash, in his own words. Other doctors told him, I've never heard of anything like this, and so he thought, this is hogwash. But then he asked some of his own patients and other patients in the hospital. He's a cardiologist, a heart doctor, so he was asking people who had been resuscitated from cardiac arrest, and the third person he talked to recalled an NDE that reminded him of the things Moody was talking about, and that initiated clinical interviews with 75 resuscitated people who had NDEs, published his findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and published Recollections of Death, a medical investigation, in 1982. So in the book Recollections of Death, a medical investigation, he had more patients than the original 75. I think it was 116, but at any rate, he's a respected cardiologist. So in 1970, he got his MD as a physician from the University of Texas Medical Branch, and then in 1978 he finished his cardiology training at the University of Florida. Although he is a Christian, he approaches the study of near-death experiences from a more skeptical and scientific attitude. Autoscopic evidence for NDEs, visualizing themselves from the ceiling. So Michael Sabom, again, is a Christian, but here's what he says in the documentary After Death. He says, there's no way you can verify the transcendental part of the experience, otherworldly environment. Autoscopic means self-visualization. They were visualizing themselves from the ceiling, lying in bed lifeless or being resuscitated. That is the verifiable part of a near-death experience, and that's what I wanted. That was the main thing that got me hooked on this thing. I pay very little attention to the tunnel, the light, the deceased relatives and friends, the religious figures. For me, as a cardiologist, scientist, and a physician, I wanted some verification. I wanted some medical records. I wanted to talk to people who had been there and seen what had happened in the room. So that was his focus in his book, and he wrote another book called Light and Death, which takes more of a religious Christian perspective, and in that book especially he mentions the case of Pamela Reynolds, who we talked about previously with the other cardiologist, Pim van Lommel. He talked about the famous case of Pamela Reynolds as well, but I believe it was Dr. Michael Sabom who made that case originally famous in his book Light and Death, and then the BBC did a documentary on it as well, The Day That I Died. In the case of Pamela Reynolds, it was at the Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, Arizona, and Dr. Robert F. Spetzler was the leading surgeon, and we discussed this case before. Pamela Reynolds had a brain aneurysm in the center of her brain, and they needed to cool her blood, drain the blood from an artery in her leg so as to deflate the aneurysm and then take it out. When they did this procedure, also they had her eyes smeared with lubricant and covered over, and they had earplugs in her ears that put out a constant clicking sound so they could measure her brain activity. So this is what made her case so special. It was her brain was being documented and analyzed, as was the case with Eben Alexander, as we discussed, the brain surgeon who had a near-death experience. But in the case of Pamela Reynolds, she said as soon as they stopped her heart, she felt herself pop out of her body and looked down at herself being operated on as if she was on the shoulder of Dr. Spetzler. And she mentioned the famous part about the drill that they used to do the surgery. It looked like her electric toothbrush. But at any rate, returning to the documentary After Death, Sabom said, I wanted to talk to people who had been there. So here's a quote from Dr. Carl Green. He was there during the surgery with Pamela Reynolds, continuing his training under Dr. Spetzler, who was the senior surgeon, and he would do the rounds in the morning to check up on the patients, and he spoke to Pamela Reynolds, and here's what he said after talking with her. He says, I was spooked. She gave me details she just shouldn't know. So for Dr. Sabom, the most important part of near-death experiences from an empirical scientist's perspective is the autoscopic evidence. People looking down at themselves when they're dead and recalling verifiable, empirically verifiable events that others can confirm. Yes, the one doctor did say that to the other doctor. Yes, we did use this instrument in this way at that time. Yes, that person's heart was stopped at the time when this was occurring. I don't know how they could have learned it, but they said they saw it looking down from the ceiling. NDE is where science meets religion. Evidence approaches proof. So continuing with Dr. Michael Sabom, he said, I think the NDE is where science meets religion. There's a big difference between proof and evidence. But enough evidence at some point makes it so close to proof that most people would say it's right, it's real. So verifiable corroborations of earthly events seen during NDEs are empirical, but so are the predicted parallels between NDEs and physics. So Michael Sabom said, I pay very little attention to the light at the tunnel and the deceased relatives and these other aspects of near-death experiences. He says those are not verifiable. What is verifiable is the things they witness in the operating room during surgery, for example. Okay, that's true, but so are the parallels between these near-death experience accounts and the laws of physics, and that's what Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli said we should be looking at. Look at the mirror symmetries between psychology, including the parapsychology of near-death experiences, and the laws of physics. So Dr. Sabom said he's uninterested in the light at the end of the tunnel, for example, but we saw in an earlier slide that according to the astronomer Alexis Brandeker, who was talking about special relativity, that if you could travel at almost exactly the speed of light, you would see all of the radiation in the universe emanate from a single point in the direction of travel. The faster you go, the more the light of the universe, even light directly behind you, would be squeezed into a smaller and smaller patch until it would become a single point that contains all of the radiation in the universe. If you could travel close to the speed of light, that's special relativity. And then, according to general relativity, the astronomer Karen Masters told us that if you were inside a black hole looking away from the singularity, then we would be able to see the evolution of the universe flash before our eyes. She too says you would see all of the light of the universe, even from stars directly behind the singularity, condensed in a single point, and furthermore you would see the entire history of the universe flash before your eyes. And that word flash is a reference to near-death experiences where people say, I saw my whole life flash before my eyes. So although we can't have other people experience what those people experienced during near-death experiences, especially this light at the end of the tunnel, still we can empirically observe that relativity theory predicts this aberration effect and general relativity predicts this gravitational lensing effect, which perfectly parallel that tunnel vision described by near-death experiences. That is empirically observable. These people wrote this down in their books, and here's the laws of physics, and here's what these astronomers say. They parallel each other. I can read. That's empirical. I can see it. That fulfills the prediction made by Pauli and Jung about the mirror symmetries between psychology and physics. So that is verifiable. Does the prediction made by Jung and Pauli that the laws of psychology and physics parallel each other, can you test that prediction? I say you can, and the evidence from near-death experiences presents one avenue towards that. So continuing on the slide, the point of no return, where we experience a life review and all of the past, present, and future of the universe. So that is a common aspect of near-death experiences. I reached a point where I knew that if I went beyond it, I couldn't get back. I had a life review. I experienced the past, the present, and future of the whole universe. So that is paralleled by holographic string theory, according to which the past, the present, and the future are conserved at each point of the cosmic horizon. That's the holographic principle. And space-time is expanding at the speed of light at that point. If you go beyond that, then not even a photon could return against the faster-than-light expansion of space-time beyond the cosmic horizon. That's why it's a point of no return. Again, there's this clear parallel between near-death experience accounts and the laws of physics. In this case, general relativity, which is the expansion rate of space-time, and holographic string theory, which talks about information conservation at the horizon of the cosmos. Oh, also, let me just focus on this right now. Bohm was most interested in this looking down from the ceiling at the body. For him, that's what really got him involved in this. Well, that is corroborated by the holographic principle. Any surface area contains all of the information in the volume of space. That's the holographic principle. So the information in a room is conserved at the walls and the floor and the ceiling of the room. And when people have these near-death experiences, that's the first thing they experience. It seems to be strong and powerful support for the autoscopic version or the autoscopic experience of a near-death experience. So it's just a really important point. Sabom doesn't mention holographic string theory, but it's not only vindicated by people's direct accounts and then corroborated by witnesses who were in the room at the time, but it's also supported by the fact that it's paralleling the predictions of holographic string theory. The information really is in the ceiling, the walls, and the room. Okay, so continuing here, threads projecting the illusion of 3D space from the cosmic horizon. That's Jung's NDE and Plato's Myth of and that's holographic string theory again. Although I haven't seen too many mentions of near-death experiences that talk about this thread stretching from the horizon of the cosmos to create the illusion of three-dimensional space, it is there in Plato's Myth of and Carl Jung. So those are two heavy hitters, really the beginning and the end of the academic theory of absolute ideas. So it's important that they experience specifically these threads of destiny. And Carl Jung's in particular, he very clearly said, it seems as if each of us is on our own little cube or box of illusion tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread. That was the dead ringer that got me involved. So Sabom talked about that's what got me hooked, this autoscopic view from the ceiling of the operating room. Well, what got me hooked was the parallel between holographic string theory and Carl Jung's near-death experience. Okay, so that was the background of the different doctors who established the tradition of near-death experience studies in the United States. And then the next few slides will be about people who actually had near-death experiences as recounted in the documentary After Death. An artist's senses are enhanced, and then they recorded your life. That's a quote that this man Howard Storm will talk about. So Howard Storm, former professor of art at Northern Kentucky University, current Christian minister and author of My Descent into Death. So he recounts his near-death experience. So let me just read through the slide and then I'll go back and reiterate some of the points. So he had a hole in his stomach in 1981. He had a hole in his stomach from which was leaking stomach acid and bacteria and the contents of the stomach into his stomach cavity, and he was slowly dying. He said it felt like fire. And he was in France at the time. He was taking some students on an art tour of the museums of Europe. He ended up in Paris, and this hole in his stomach happened, and for 10 hours he suffered horribly, like he had fire in his stomach, literally. And then eventually they said, we can't find a doctor, and he gave up and he stopped trying to breathe. And then he says, I woke from my consciousness standing there next to the bed, feeling better than ever in my life. I could see almost 360 degrees. My depth of field was total. Everything far was in focus. All senses greatly enhanced. So he talked about how he could feel all of the crevices beneath his bare feet in the linoleum floor, and he could hear the buzzing fluorescent lights really loudly. He looked out the window and things far, far away were as if they were right in front of him, and he could see every detail of everything. And he said this was especially important because he was an artist. So he was apparently a successful art professor, and he taught videography, so sense perception was his bailiwick. That was his bread and butter. That's what his profession was. So he was very impressed by how heightened his senses were. So he stood up and looked down at his dead body. He mentions later a slab of meat, and he didn't recognize it as himself at first. So he said he was talking to his wife. She didn't pay any attention to him. He began yelling at her because, why are you ignoring me? He didn't get it. And, who put this thing in the bed here? And why does it look like me? And then he said that some beings were out in the hall of the hospital calling to him. He walked out into the hall, and he realized as soon as he stepped out of the room, then the light of the room, that he wouldn't be able to get back in. He felt there was some impossibility of him returning back to that room, and these people in the hall, who he thought were hospital employees, were calling him to follow him down the hall. He said, I need a surgeon, I need help. They said, yeah, we know all about what you need, just follow us, come with us. And he said they kept in front of him. It was indistinct, he couldn't see their faces exactly, and they just kept walking and walking and walking for over a mile. And he couldn't see any of the details around him. Everything was gray. And then he began to realize this isn't the hospital anymore. And these people, they became more and more aggressive towards him. The more he started to question what was going on, the more they started to shove him and push him, until he began to realize that this isn't the hospital. And he was starting to come to the conclusion that he was dead. So when he refused to go any further, he said they really dug into him, and they were saying obscene things into him and ripping his body apart. So it was a dark, dark place, and he realized he was in hell. He said he was torn apart by cruel beings in a dark realm. He had been an atheist. He recalled his childhood prayers to Jesus. A tiny star appeared in the sky and rapidly got brighter. He grabbed the person, Jesus, and started moving straight upwards. He said he thought he was coming to a galaxy, a huge whirl of light. And then Jesus said to him, then he spoke to me telepathically and said, I've got some people that I want you to meet. They recorded your life and they want to show you. So that was the major parallel with holographic string theory that I wanted to point out, this idea of the life review. So he's down in hell, he's being torn apart, his eyes are being gouged out, but he's not in a physical body, so this doesn't kill him. His physical body's dead and back in the hospital room. This is his mental body. And I watched a couple of YouTube videos where he elaborated some more. There was a lot of near-death experience accounts in the documentary After Death, so to get a little more detail I looked. He said that he did not come to the edge of the universe. He thought he came to a galaxy, a huge whirl of light. He called it a suburb of heaven. And he was speaking to this person who had saved him from hell. He said he buried his face in that person's chest. I'm pretty sure he was saying that this was Jesus himself, because he was thinking about Jesus, and then all of a sudden he looks up and this bright star gets brighter and brighter and brighter and comes down there to save him from these horrible people. And he grabs tight and buries his face in this person's chest and starts shooting straight up. So the expansion of space-time is what people experience during these near-death experiences. First they rise out of their body, and then they rise higher and higher and faster until they're hurtling through a dark tunnel toward a point of light. Howard Storm didn't mention the dark tunnel toward a point of light, but he did mention a tiny star that got brighter and brighter as it approached him when he was in a place of darkness. So it kind of seems like a reverse tunnel vision, or a tunnel vision where he was approaching maybe this bright light, and it seemed to him that it was coming closer to him. At any rate, there are some of these elements that are typical of a near-death experience, especially this life review. Your life has been recorded, so that's holographic string theory. The past, the present, and the future of any three-dimensional volume of space are recorded as if on a holographic film at the two-dimensional surface area. And perhaps Howard Storm was at the outermost boundary of our galaxy. It's just a speculation, because the holographic principle says any surface area of any volume of space is where the information is, and if you're in your room, the information is on the walls and the ceiling. That gives you this 360-degree panoramic view. You are in the walls, the ceiling, and the floor, according to the holographic principle. But if you were to go out and try to observe that information at the surface area of your room, the information, according to holographic string theory, recedes to the next concentric boundary, which would be the atmosphere of Earth, and then perhaps the halo of the solar system and the galactic halo, and then ultimately the horizon of the cosmos. Those are speculations, but the point is that I'm looking for the parallels between near-death experiences and physics, which culminate with holographic string theory. So I'll just now continue with the next near-death experience. There's a lot of rich details of all of these, but I'm keeping it brief for the purposes of this class. Alive and then more alive, the ripple effect of my actions. So Dr. Mary Neal is an orthopedic surgeon and author of To Heaven and Back. She drowned in 1999. She was pinned with her kayak under 8 to 10 feet of water, and here's what she said. While she was under there, looking up, 8 to 10 feet underwater, pinned under a rock. She says, I would think about the fact that I must be dead, but I didn't feel dead. I felt more alive than I've ever felt. I felt like I was just part of the water. I felt magnificent, actually. I knew that I was being held by Christ as purely as I know anything. So then she says, I could see this bloated purple body, but I never felt alive and then dead. I never felt conscious and then unconscious. I felt conscious and then more conscious. I felt alive and then more alive. So after almost a half an hour, she said they fished her dead body out of the water, and she was watching it from above. She saw her dead purple body, but she had never felt the transition from life to death. It was, in fact, the reverse. She felt a transition from living to being more alive than ever. And in this documentary, After Death, they move from one near-death experience account to the next, I guess to keep it from getting too monotonous, and they want to keep your attention activated. So it skips around, but one of the important points from her near-death experience that I want to talk about is when she talked about being taught about the ripple effects of her actions and other people's actions on hers. She said she was shown the ripple effect of her actions and words, and this is a quote, 20, 25, 35 times removed from me, and that she gained a complete understanding of everyone's backstory. So what she means here by 20, 25, 35 times removed from me is that every action that she did, maybe harmful words, and how those words affected people. She knew all about the backstory of her own motivations, what led her to that action. And then she could experience directly how her action of saying a mean thing to some one person was then spread from that person to the next person, 35 people removed from her. And that she would understand how her actions incorporated into the backstory of everyone else that was affected by her actions. And she could similarly feel all of the things that people had done to her that had impressed especially negative emotions on her. She could understand the backstory of what led that person to hurt her, and then what caused that person to be mean at that instance, and this domino effect of actions leading to 35 people back. So she was becoming aware not only of the past, present, and future and reliving the intense emotions of her own life, but she was feeling that for all of the radius of people rippling in her biography. I thought that was an interesting point. If all of us are ultimately merged together at each point of the horizon of the cosmos, then each of us is experiencing what everyone else is experiencing simultaneously. That's the holographic principle of string theory, and it's also what people who have near-death experiences often recall. And it's just interesting to hear this doctor, this orthopedic surgeon, expressing her direct experience of that. What would it be like to experience everyone else's emotions and how they're interrelated and interwoven with yours? So I just thought that was interesting, and I mentioned it. I'm chasing the ambulance like a rocket ship. So here's the near-death experience account of a pilot named Dale Black, author of Flight to Heaven and Visiting Heaven. So he crashed a plane, or was in a plane that crashed in 1969. And he's a pilot, and he was with some friends flying a small plane, and they crashed into the top of this 7 to 8 story mausoleum and fell to the ground. So here's his recollection. He says, I'm looking down and I'm realizing there's my body, but I'm up here. I can't be dead because I've never felt more alive. I was not only alive, I was free. I realized that, okay, I am a spirit, I have a soul, and I used to live in that body. So there's a major point of this class: immortality and the unreality of death. Again and again, people who have these near-death experiences, their hearts stop and then they're resuscitated. They said, I'm looking down at my body. Michael Sabom, the cardiologist who helped found near-death experience studies in academia, says this is what really impresses him, because other people can verify what the person having the near-death experience experienced. And I'm saying, in addition to that, the holographic principle, which says that the information of any volume of space is recorded at the surface area, accounts for why people often recall looking down and seeing themselves from above. So continuing this account from Dale Black, he says, I'm watching my body in Chuck, and I'm chasing the ambulance as it goes through the streets. So the ambulance eventually came to the crash site and put the dead bodies in the ambulance, and then he was following the ambulance from above, looking down, and he says he had no idea how he could do it, but he was effortlessly flying through the streets towards the hospital. And then he says, in another part of the documentary, where he's now in the hospital, he said, I started moving out of the room. I had left the hospital, traveling almost like a rocket ship, just moving out of this atmosphere as if in deep space, and there was a beam of light lighting the pathway of where I was going. Tiny spheres of light, these were beings going to Earth. The light I am looking at is coming from none other than God himself. So they patch together the accounts of these near-death experiences, but here are some of the fundamental parallels with holographic string theory. He says, first he rises above his body slowly, and then he's traveling like a rocket ship, just moving out of this atmosphere, out of the atmosphere of Earth, into deep space, and then he's having this tunnel vision with the light at the end of the tunnel, which is none other than God himself. So if you're to travel at the speed of light through space, you would see all of the light in the universe condensed in a single point. That's the aberration effect. That single point is the singularity. Any single point of light that contains all of the light of the universe, that's a singularity. And here you see Dale Black say it was God himself. Psyche equals singularity. God is what physicists call the gravitational singularity, and each of us is an absolute part and parcel of that omnicentric singularity. Each of us is also a singularity. We're all inconceivably, simultaneously one with and different from each other. But just to reiterate here, Dale Black, like so many other near-death experience accounts, his has these typical aspects of rising slowly and then hurtling through a tunnel towards a point of all loving light. Standing at the gates of heaven, the golden city. So this is the last slide we'll do from the documentary After Death. Don Piper, he's a Christian minister and author of 90 Minutes in Heaven. So he had a car crash in Texas on January 18, 1989. It was a horrible car crash, a rainy day, and a tractor trailer plowed into his car, and he died instantly. He said, the moment the truck struck me, I was standing at the gates of heaven. It was like the inside of an oyster, like pearl, almost like it was living, because the light reflecting off the gate. Heaven is light, God is light. It's astounding. So he talks about his experience here at the gates of heaven. And I see the gates of heaven as the point of no return that people talk about. Sometimes they'll see a waterfall. The cosmic horizon, it appears to different people in different ways. But what I interpret his near-death experience to indicate is that he was out at the horizon of the cosmos, and he interpreted that as a gate, and he interpreted this as the city of God made of gold. So continuing, he says, I was surrounded by people I knew and loved in life. He met his grandfather, with whom he was very close. And when he said when his grandfather died, he did not look good. His body looked very bad, but now everyone looked great. He said they looked like they were in the prime of their life. And then he also talked about the music that he heard. Thousands of songs at the same time without chaos, all kinds of instruments, he said, permeated by the music. It was pouring through every pore of his existence. He says, my senses were incredibly vivid. The people parted, and I could see through the gate. A long boulevard bisects the city of gold. So many of the things that we experience here are there, but it looks infinitely more glorious and perfect. So I wanted to include that quote in this series because I am arguing that the cosmic horizon is what Carl Jung calls the collective unconscious. It's what Plato has Timaeus in his dialogue, the Timaeus, called the mother substance. It's where Socrates says the absolute ideas, like the absolute idea of justice and beauty, exist. When you die, you can take the chariot of your soul, if you've been practicing philosophy long enough, and ride all the way out to the outermost sphere of the universe where you can perceive the absolute ideas. And it's those absolute ideas from which the three-dimensional world that we experience, the material, imperfect world, is projected. The perfect forms exist at the outermost sphere, which I'm equating with the gates of heaven that Don Piper talked about. And it is from there that our existence is projected, specifically by these fundamental strings of energy. Okay, so that will conclude the focus on the near-death experience accounts of this class. A lot of the people in the After Death documentary were Christians. It was a Christian-focused documentary. They didn't push Christianity too hard, trying to convert people to it, but the near-death experience accounts that they chose to highlight, many of them were definitely Christian-centric, and there's nothing wrong with that. But this class I'm teaching from the theory of the perennial philosophy, that different religions and philosophies from around the world all have these obvious similarities because they're all originating from the same fundamental ground of truth. Nevertheless, the focus on Christianity is appropriate for the next series of slides because we're going back to refocus on Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death, in which he distills psychology after Freud back to the great Christian theologian Soren Kierkegaard. I hope you are enjoying this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. You can also click the link to my website, psycheandsingularity.com, to sign up for a multiple choice test with over 100 well-crafted questions related to this class, and links to the specific parts of each video where the answers can be found. If you take that test to the end, you will receive a certificate indicating that you have become a Psyche and Singularity scholar. In addition to access to that test, there is also the opportunity to answer essay questions that ask you to relate concepts covered in this class to your own hero's journey. I will personally respond to each of those essays, point out any other parts of this class that I think might bolster your plan. Finally, I want to point out that this course is sponsored by the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being, and you can check those guys out at divineinfinitebeing.com.